technology, I can see the red light now. If you would direct your attention, if you have any kind of notations there, if you remember when we concluded our last review session, we had finished the Revolutionary War. We had brought the conflict to Yorktown, and what we said is, in terms of fighting the revolution, that really all that we thought you needed to know was that the most important battle was Saratoga, and it was the most important battle because it brought France into the conflict and globalized the war. Another thing I think I'd like you to know about the revolution is the civil nature of it. When I say civil nature of it, and we made this point, last time we reviewed, we said, look, the Revolutionary War was in fact a civil war. There were people in America who opposed independence and opposed it violently. The Loyalists tended to be people who in some manner or another were associated with England, were pacifists because of their religious beliefs, in one way or another believed that it was a mistake to seek formal independence, and in many cases were willing to fight against it. About 20% of the population considered themselves loyalists. So they were fighting against those who were fighting for independence, along with Britain, who was fighting to subdue this rebellion. I mean, one of the things that that you see as a part of the southern part of the war is a lot of loyalist versus patriot fighting down there. And the southern part of the war culminates in the defeat at Yorktown. And when the British are defeated at Yorktown, we said the reason the war ends then, and that is 1781, is because they had attempted to subdue New England unsuccessfully. They had attempted to subdue the middle colonies unsuccessfully. And now they brought the war down to the south and were unsuccessful there. And so the prospect was continuing to fight at the risk of losing more territory to France and their other enemies, or basically suing for peace and arranging a peace agreement that would allow America to be independent. And so they chose peace. And remember, we said that once the Battle of Yorktown culminates in September, a peace delegation is appointed and they go off to Paris, and there they eventually come to an agreement. The agreement that ends the war is called the Treaty of Paris 1783. That agreement included a couple of important things. One is basically European recognition of the independence of America. England formally recognizes America as an independent country. France formally recognizes America as an independent country. Spain formally recognizes America as an independent country. Also important in that agreement was the establishment of a western border. The western border of the United States was established at the Mississippi. So the western border was the Mississippi, the northern border was roughly the Canadian border, and the southern border was Florida. Now, although Spain was on, Spain, as a result of that conflict, was aligned with France, they get back Florida and the territory west of the Mississippi. So that becomes a part of Spain, and the war ends, and there are issues in the aftermath. Now, I think one of the things that we talked about last time also is how does the war affect society? And one of the things that we mentioned, and I want to pick up today, is that certainly the war affected slavery. We said in the aftermath of the Revolution, 8 of the 13 original colonies, now states, are going to move to abolish slavery. Manumission, freeing your own slaves, becomes easier. States increasingly make it difficult to import slaves into the United States, into the new country, into their states. And in 1808, the international slave trade is going to be eliminated. On some level, the revolution raises the inconsistency of slavery with the principles and ideology of the Declaration of Independence. But we leave slavery in the aftermath of the revolution as an evil, almost a consensus in America that it was evil, but a necessary evil. An evil that we're not sure how to deal with at that time, but are fairly sure that there's no practical way to abolish slavery at this time. And so, although in the North there's going to be movement to eliminate slavery, there aren't many slaves there. And in the South, where there are significant slave populations, there really isn't a meaningful movement to abolish slavery. Although there are movements to manumit individual slaves and to limit the amount of slaves that are imported into that area. I mean, there's also discussion about, you know, equality within society, and that really spills into the next thing. I mean, did the Revolution address class stratification? Even in colonial America, there were better people, there were middle-class people, there were of the better sort, the middling sort, or the meaner sorts of people. Did the Revolution address that? Well, on some level, yes. Right? I mean, on some level, you know, the Revolution assaults class distinctions, and it promotes equality, economic equality, political equality, and, you know, that's some of the reason why there's turmoil in the aftermath. Now, also, when we end the Revolution, we say, okay, now what are the challenges? Well, the biggest challenge in the aftermath of the Revolution is to create governments that embody the principles of the Declaration of Independence. So we say, okay, we're going to explain to the world in the Declaration of Independence why we are or want to be independent from England. And what we say is because all men are created equal, and because the power of government emanates from the consent of the governed. So what would a government look like that would embody these principles? And so what Americans now have to do is create those governments, because the power of government emanates from the consent of the governed. So on the individual state levels, they do just that. As early as May of 1776, the Continental Congress had ordered individual states to reformulate their state governments, and they did. Right, the colonial governments, you know, transformed into state governments. They established charters and constitutions that, you know, outlined how they would function on the state level. Massachusetts leads the way with an important precedent. In Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Constitution, which largely comes from the pen of John Adams, right, was ratified by a special convention. In other words, the voters of Massachusetts sent delegates to a special convention that ratified the Massachusetts Constitution. And that precedent is going to be established. Other states are going to ratify constitutions that outline governments, and most all of them have bicameral legislatures, which mean two houses, governors, independent judiciaries, bills of rights, that sets kind of the stage for eventually a central government. The challenge in the aftermath of the war is establishing a central government. And America in 1777, a year after, you know, or several months after the Declaration of Independence, adopts a system of central government called the Articles of Confederation. Now, although the Articles of Confederation were proposed and ratified by Congress, and basically Congress lived by them, they were not approved by all 13 colonies until 1781. It took 4 years of kind of debate before the Articles of Confederation were ratified by all 13 colonies. Does anyone besides the instructor and the star of stage and screen have remember why or what the delay was? I mean, we said, okay, John Dickinson was largely responsible for the Articles of Confederation. They were proposed, they were ratified by Congress, they were distributed to the states, but the states refused to ratify them for 4 years. Does anybody recall what the delay was? Besides myself and Pat, yes. It is true that under the Articles of Confederation, any alteration in the document had to be a unanimous vote. That is in fact true. But that's not what delayed it. Remember, it was a debate between the landed and the landless states. that some of the states claimed land west of the Appalachian Mountains, Connecticut, North Carolina, New York, Virginia. 5 of the 13 original states did not have any western land claims. Those 5 states insisted, before they agreed to a system of central government, that the 8 states that did have land claims surrender those claims to a new United States government. Now, until they do that in 1781, Maryland in particular will not ratify the Articles of Confederation. When Virginia and the other states eventually acquiesce and surrender their claims, all 13 states ratify the Articles of Confederation, and they become the system of central government. Under the Articles of Confederation, the central government was made up of one unicameral legislature. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was no independent executive. There was no federal judiciary. All that there was a Congress in which each state had one equal vote. If you remember, under the Articles of Confederation, states could send as many delegates as they wanted to Congress, but each state had one vote, and that was the majority of the delegation. Now, under the Articles of Confederation, this central government had far-reaching powers. They could make war, they could establish peace, they could make treaties, they could deal with the Native Americans, they could mint money, they could supervise a post office. There were lots of things that they had the authority to do, or lots of things they had the responsibility to do. However, there were important authorities that were denied to them. 3 in particular. Does anyone remember, besides Alex and myself, any of the important authorities that were denied Congress under the Articles of Confederation? Alex, you and I remember quite a bit. I don't know about the other kids.
I want to see how much Sam knows about this one.
He's a dear friend of yours.
Yes.
Sam.
We can't tax.
Yes, they did not have the power to raise revenues directly. If they could not raise revenues directly, where were they going to get money to finance their activities?
The states had to donate.
The states basically, donate is a good word. The states assessed, but it was ultimately a donation. Joe, what else could Congress not do? Go ahead,
They couldn't regulate trade or organize a military.
Yes, they could not regulate trade among the states. Under the Articles of Confederation, each state had their own money. Each state had tariffs against other state products. The Congress didn't have the authority to regulate trade among the states or even between the states and foreign countries. So there was a chaotic sort of trade circumstance that was established, and they really didn't have the direct authority to raise an army. I mean, the army that they called forth was called forth by the individual states in the Revolution, and they didn't have tax revenue to pay such an army. Now, I mean, it's not surprising that what would be created would be a weak central government. After all, Americans were revolting not from their own colonial governments, but they were revolting against an oppressive parliament and king that they thought exerted authority from far away from where they were. And so they weren't likely to create a central government that replicated that, at least not at first. But there were certainly serious problems associated with governance under the Articles of Confederation. And probably the most prominent of those problems was they couldn't pay their bills. I mean, they couldn't pay their bills, they couldn't raise the revenue they needed to pay their bondholders. They couldn't finance their activities. They couldn't assert themselves diplomatically. They had a very difficult time forming a quorum to actually ratify the Treaty of Paris. They couldn't assert themselves with the Spanish, or in particular with the Native Americans. And so, I mean, they basically didn't have a full functioning central government that could do the things that a central government could do. It's interesting that that really the issue that brings forth the movement for a stronger central government involves trade. Remember, we said there is this meeting, that there are people in America that have a nationalistic viewpoint, that think that the country needs a more centralized, powerful national government. But the prelude to kind of a constitutional convention to change it involves trade. The Annapolis meeting in 1786 is called by the various states in the Chesapeake region that want to discuss trade regulations. At that Annapolis meeting in 1786 is Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. Now remember, both Madison and Hamilton are minor players in the Revolution. I mean, yes, Hamilton was Washington's aide-de-camp. He was his right-hand man. He had served with distinction at Yorktown, and Madison had served in positions of authority, but they were not major players in the Revolution. But they emerge as major players in the aftermath. And they are advocates of a powerful national government for different reasons now that I think about it. Remember, there are two big reasons why people want a powerful national government. One is that there's some level of chaos. Under the Articles of Confederation, they can't pay their bills, they can't assert themselves diplomatically, they can't regulate trade, there are problems. That's one reason. Another reason was, and you don't hear as much about that, is that people like Madison feared the power of state governments, feared the power that states were asserting, that they would threaten things like private property, contract laws, other things that were necessary for stability. So there were multiple reasons why people wanted a more powerful national government. Now I should tell you, before we go to the Constitution, that there are some successes by Congress under the Articles of Confederation. And in particular, it is dealing with the areas west of the Appalachian Mountains. The Northwest, I should say, the land ordinances, and there's actually three. The Ordinance of 1785, 86, and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 all deal with organizing and settling the land west of the Appalachians. And what those ordinances outline is a system to divide that land and organize it and eventually create territories that would become eventually states. So a system of kind of settlement, organization of government, and finally admission of those territories into the Union of States is established by Congress in these land ordinances. Now, I mean, it's important to know that, but one thing that you really have to know is the Northwest Land Ordinance had a very important stipulation in it. So these ordinances are passed by Congress to deal with the orderly, settlement there and organization and creation of government. But the Northwest Ordinance said that the land north of the Ohio River and south of Canada, which would be nowadays Ohio, nowadays Michigan, all of that territory, that slavery would be prohibited there. Now, Hera, the reason why that's so important, the Northwest Ordinance, is because the question that arises in the aftermath well, in particular in the aftermath of the Mexican War is, can Congress regulate slavery in the territories? Yes.
Wouldn't that be kind of different though, since there were different governments?
Yeah, you know what though?
The Articles.
You're correct in one sense, that was the Northwest Ordinance was passed under the Articles of Confederation, but it was actually reaffirmed with the new Congress. And that's something you don't really see, but it was. It was reaffirmed by Congress, when the new Constitution was created. So even though, we kind of talk about the precedents there, that precedence was reaffirmed. And what Mike is talking about is, that big controversy in the aftermath of the Mexican War was, this territory that was acquired as a result of the Mexican War, could slavery be allowed, or would slavery be allowed to spread there? And the South, if you remember, argued, look, Congress has no constitutional authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. Now, the North argued, oh yes, they do, and they have. They have with the Northwest Ordinance, which Mike is right, it was under the Articles of Confederation, but reaffirmed with the Constitution. And they also limited slavery in the territories with the Missouri Compromise. So those important precedents, become controversial. So here we see in 1787, the then Congress taking action to prohibit the spread of slavery there. Now here's what's interesting. When that Northwest Ordinance passed, that prohibited the spread of slavery into the Northwest Territory, Southerners voted for that. So in 1787, there were Southerners who actually voted to prohibit the spread of slavery. Now, slavery was allowed to spread south of the Mississippi River, or south of the Ohio River, Kentucky, Tennessee, largely because there were already slaves there. But north, where there were no slaves, Congress supported legislation to prohibit the spread of slavery there. Which is an indication that there was some sort of consensus that if you don't have slaves already, you don't want them. And you really want to attempt to stop the spread of this terrible institution. Now that certainly is all going to change because of the cotton gin and the lucrative nature of cotton and the importance of cotton in the Southern economy and the necessity of slaves to grow, process that cotton. That's going to change. But the cotton gin doesn't come around until 1793, and this is 1787. Well, okay. The Northwest Ordinance aside, there are problems. And to some extent, those problems come to a head with Shays Rebellion. Hey, what state was Shays Rebellion in? Does anyone besides Bob and myself recall? Go ahead, Bob.
Massachusetts.
It was in Massachusetts. And the rebels in Massachusetts were from the western or the eastern part of the state?
Western.
They were from the western part of the state. And Joe, what was their occupation largely?
They were like farmers.
They were farmers. And what was their complaint? The Shayites, the followers of Shay, had a complaint, and that's why they revolted. What was their complaint?
Do with like a whiskey tax?
No, it's not a whiskey tax.
That's a whiskey rebellion, sorry.
Yeah, but Jim, your ex-best friend, has a thought. Yes, go ahead. Not really, not in Massachusetts. Yes. Yeah, many of them were veterans of the Revolution that had not been paid their pensions, and that was true of Daniel Shays, who was their leader. And what else? I mean, taxes were a part of it, but not a whiskey tax. Yes. Yes, they could not pay their debts, because they couldn't pay their mortgages because farming went bad. And they were heavily taxed. And they had little representation in the legislature in Boston. And so responding to oppressive taxation and responding to difficulty in paying their debts, they menaced the courts there, and they shut them down, and they began to raise arms and an army and refused to kind of abide by foreclosures and other things. And they threatened an arsenal in Springfield, Missouri, and the result was, this rebellion. And remember, the wealthy citizens of Boston raised money for an army to go down and put down Shays Rebellion, which they were able to do fairly easily. There was some limited loss of life. Shays was forced to flee. But Shays Rebellion is more symbolic than it is violent. Now, how does Shays Rebellion fit into the kind of approach of a constitutional convention? How does this fit into things? Go ahead, Jim.
Didn't it show how weak the federal government was and that they couldn't put the insurrection down?
Yes, I mean, an inept, weak federal government would not be able to kind of secure order and stability if something like Shays Rebellion would spread more broadly. And the thing about Shays Rebellion is it was really just reflective of a lot of people. I mean, there were a lot of Daniel Shays out there in a lot of different places. And if this kind of disorder was allowed to continue, how could America kind of prosper? How could America advance? And so from a number of, one other thing about Shays Rebellion, incidentally, is this. That what Madison didn't like about Shays Rebellion, Madison wasn't afraid of the Shayites rebelling. Madison was afraid of the Massachusetts legislature's response to the Shayites. That the Shayites rebel and the legislature responds by reducing taxes, lifting up bankruptcy laws, threatening private property. And so, you know, Madison was concerned about local governments that were basically too responsive to the mobs and to the masses, right? And the Shayites represented the mobs and the masses. And remember, this rebellion is going to be in the winter of 1786, 1787. And at the Annapolis Convention, they had called for another meeting to occur in Philadelphia in May of 1787. Now remember, at Annapolis, you didn't have all states represented. But when the delegates went to Philadelphia in 1787, 12 of the 13 states sent delegations. Now, eventually we call that meeting the Constitutional Convention. But why did Congress and the states call for that meeting officially? Go ahead. Yes, to revise the official purpose of what becomes known as the Constitutional Convention is to modify the Articles of Confederation. Now, given the attendance, why would that be impossible from the very beginning? I just kind of mentioned it a moment ago, but why would it be impossible for the very beginning for the Articles of Confederation to be modified?
Only a few of the states were planning to show up.
Only 12 of the 13 showed up, and any state, remember, to alter the Articles of Confederation, you needed all 13 states to agree. And Rhode Island didn't send a delegation, so they clearly weren't going to agree. Yet, the convention met, and we talked about the delegations. 55 men, at one time or another, attended what became known as the Constitutional Convention. The convention met from May until September. 42 of the 55 men who met there made it to the end. 39 of the 42 signed the Constitution. 3 refused. Right? Of the others that didn't make it to the end, many of them probably had opposition as well. Now, we said some important people were there, and important people were not there. Tell me an important person that was there. Go ahead, George.
I would say someone who's not.
Either one.
Was not George Washington.
George Washington was there. What was his role in the Constitutional Convention? He was there, and what was his role, Joe?
My name's Tom.
Tom. Yeah, that's right. Tom is the, Joe is the older brother. But Tom, go ahead.
I don't know what his role is.
You know who you are, though, right? Clearly you know that. Yes, go ahead, Tulip. He was the presiding officer. He was the president of the convention, the chairman of the convention. So he presided over it. But beyond presiding over the convention, what did Washington give this meeting? And we talked about this. We said, Washington's sheer presence, yes. Yes. It gave it respectability, validity, because Washington was the most trusted man in the country. Remember, Washington had surrendered power after the Revolutionary War. Washington, prior to the Revolutionary War, thwarted a coup, at Newburgh, the Newburgh Conspiracy. And then after the war, he surrendered his sword and said, "I'll never come back to public life." And he only came back to public life because he was urged vigorously by his friends and others that if he didn't come to the convention, that it was a possibility that the whole thing that he had fought for would come unraveled. Who else was or was not there? Go ahead, Jay. Madison was in fact there, and what was his role? Pardon me? Yes, Madison is the most important delegate, right? He's the best prepared. His specific role, though, he said he orchestrated everything. How so? What does he do? What does he bring? Go ahead, Ken. I hear less than his notes become really what we know about the convention, among other people's notes. But Madison's major role is something called the Virginia Plan. Right? The Virginia Plan becomes the, I don't want to say the emphasis, but it becomes the agenda. Right? The agenda of the Constitutional Convention starts with a proposal from Virginia, drafted by Madison, for a brand new system of central government. So what Madison's Virginia Plan does is it basically would necessitate throwing out the articles, starting again, creating a new system of central government. So Madison is important. Who else was or was not there? Go ahead.
Thomas Jefferson was
not there. Where was he?
No idea.
Yes, good.
Was he in France?
He was the ambassador to France. Go ahead, Belay. Who else was not or was there? Was Hamilton there?
Was it Adams?
John Adams was not there, nor was Sam Adams there. Neither one of them. In fact, only 8 original signers of the Declaration of Independence were there, yes. Was there, the oldest delegate. Right? Hamilton was there, yes. Washington was there. Jefferson, neither Adams. Hancock were not there. Richard Henry Lee, I don't believe, I'm pretty sure Lee was not there. And as we said, only 8 of the original signatories of the Declaration of Independence. It was a new group of people. Now, the Virginia Plan that Madison proposes, which becomes the agenda of the Constitutional Convention, established a government that would have 3 branches. So one of the things that the delegates agreed to was a government that would have 3 branches and have checks and balances. That among the branches of government, powers would be distributed, and those powers would be checked and balanced against each other. That means that the delegates to the Constitutional Convention had a healthy suspicion of human nature. To some extent, the Constitutional Convention is a backlash against the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is this idealistic, enlightened document that all men are created equal and the power of government is lodged with the consent of the governed. It is a liberal document. Liberal meaning that the Declaration of Independence shows a confidence in the people. The Constitution is going to be a conservative document. Why is it a conservative document? Because it doesn't show confidence in the people. It shows suspicion. Look, the people can govern themselves, but only if their passions and their greed and self-interest are played off against each other with checks and balances. If you think about it, checks and balances in themselves show a suspicion of human nature. And those who are suspicious of human nature are usually conservatives. Those who are confident in human nature are liberals. The Declaration of Independence is liberal. The Constitution tends to be more conservative. Right? Why is it more conservative? Because left to their own devices, people basically created some level of chaos. They took advantage of their influence in the state level governments. They took advantage of the chaotic situation for their own trade circumstances. And without kind of people being willing to sacrifice for the common good, a powerful government had to be established to check their passions and their interests. That's what the people that went there thought. Now, in terms of the Constitution, there are 3 parts that you should know. One is the Virginia Plan and the Great Compromise. Was the Virginia Plan adopted? Not really. Was a version of the Virginia Plan adopted? Yes. What was the version called? Yes.
Great compromise.
It was called the Great Compromise, which would be in quotes, or, Tom, don't call me Joe, the Connecticut Compromise. The Connecticut Compromise. Right? Did you see how upset he was when I called him Joe? He was angry, he was furious, right? I always thought Joe was a nice fellow. Apparently, that's probably why I forgot what I don't know. The Connecticut Compromise. Now, here's a question. What's the only difference between the Connecticut Compromise that was ratified as a result of the Constitution and the Constitution as it stands today? Say it. What's the only difference between the Connecticut Compromise, right, which was ratified as a part of the Constitution, and the Constitution as it exists today? There was one modification that was made in the progressive era. Go to it.
No, never mind.
Go, Bob.
Direct election of
The
senators.
direct election of senators. What constitutional amendment was that, Bobby?
17.
Ooh, he is on fire, Ken. It was the 17th Amendment. In the original Constitution, Bob, I believe senators were appointed by state legislatures, right? So the Connecticut Compromise established a bicameral legislature. How were members of the House of Representatives going to be elected or appointed in the Constitution, Jackie?
By
By
population.
population and by popular vote. The second issue that you should know of the Constitutional Convention is the dispute over slavery. What is the dispute over slavery? Is there really a meaningful conversation in the Constitutional Convention about abolishing slavery, George? No. So what is the conversation in the Constitutional Convention? What does it involve? It really doesn't involve abolishing slavery, yes?
How slavery should be represented.
Yes. How should slaves be counted? For purposes of taxation and for purposes of representation. What was the final agreement on that, dear Beck? Slaves shall be counted as what? 3/5. 3/5 of a person. Are the words slave and slavery ever mentioned in the Constitution? No. Would the Constitution have allowed all the states in the Union to abolish slavery? Yes. Every state in the Union could have abolished slavery. Could the national government have passed legislation to abolish slavery in states against their will? No one thought that that could be true. So no one thought, including Abraham Lincoln. Remember in Lincoln's inaugural address, he said, look, I have no intention of touching slavery where it exists. I don't think I have the authority to do so, and I have no intention to do so. But what about the Emancipation Proclamation? The Emancipation Proclamation, if you recall, and I have a sneaking suspicion, incidentally, that the Emancipation Proclamation will be prominent on the AP test. Can I tell you why, Reber? Reber, are you up there? Can I tell you why I think the Emancipation Proclamation will be prominent on the AP test? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
The reason I think is because it's the 150th anniversary. So this year was the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, and the AP is conscious of that kind of stuff, anniversaries, so I wouldn't be surprised. But even though the Emancipation Proclamation was a federal edict, it was a wartime edict issued by a commander-in-chief that occurred because of a domestic insurrection. That commander-in-chief did not believe that he had the authority to free slaves in areas that were not part of the rebellion. I mean, the Constitution did not seem to give the federal government the authority to tamper with domestic institutions. And if you remember, when slavery was eventually abolished, it was not abolished by federal legislation, but by a constitutional amendment. What constitutional amendment was that, Tom Kromka?
13.
In super genius, Kromka. That is correct. It was the 13th Amendment. Yes, it was the 13th Amendment of the Constitution. So, yes, nowhere in the Constitution is the word slave or slavery mentioned. Probably that would allow for states to abolish slavery. Nowhere is there any kind of indication that Congress had authority over slavery. It was considered to be a domestic institution that states could choose or not choose to have. Now, one thing that was in the Constitution besides the 3/5 Compromise was a stipulation called the Fugitive Slave Clause that suggested that, escaped slaves had to be returned. So there are 3 things in the Constitution that deal with slavery. One is the 3/5 Compromise. Secondly is the Fugitive Slave Clause. And thirdly was a stipulation in the Constitution that the international slave trade could not be touched for 20 years. That Congress could regulate the international slave trade, but not for 20 years. Which they do in exactly 20 years. They abolish it. The third thing about the Constitution you should know involves the election of the president by the Electoral College. The importance of the president. The president of the United States is created in the Constitution, is a fairly powerful position. Why do you think that was true? Why do you think that the delegates created a fairly powerful president in the wake of a war against what they considered to be an oppressive king? There's a factor involved here. Yes? That's exactly why it was, because they knew that Washington would agree to be first president and that he would establish precedents to protect the power for the people, that he would not abuse that power. And to some extent, Washington does just that. One of the things that Washington again does is retire after 2 terms. And until Franklin Roosevelt, under extraordinary circumstances, violates that tradition, no one else challenged it, which kind of established and the other thing that Washington didn't have was an heir. He had no natural children. So there was no natural born successor to Washington, and he retires in 2 terms, and he restrains his use, his powers. It's really others that expand the power of the presidency. Jackson, Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt. These are going to be the people that expand the power of the presidency. Lyndon Johnson, not Washington necessarily. But the Electoral College, as a means of electing a president, is based on, the idea that it's not practical to have a national election. And so that delegates to the Electoral College, or electors of the Electoral College, would be appointed by the states on whatever basis they saw fit. It wasn't until later that the idea of electing electors to the Electoral College came into currency. Initially, state legislatures picked these people in whatever manner they saw as appropriate. And then those people were to vote for the president and the vice president, right? Two votes for the president. Now, okay, the Constitution was completed and presented to some extent with an apology. I mean, a lot of what you read about the delegates, they basically say this: well, look, this isn't perfect, but it's the best we can do. So the people that created the Constitution were not heralding it as this fabulous document that was going to solve all problems. What they presented it as is something better than what we had, and the best that could be achieved. And what they said was that this document would not become the law of the land until 9 of the 13 states held special conventions and ratified that document in those conventions. And so after September of 1787, that's exactly what started to happen. I think 11 of the 13 states held ratifying conventions. I'm not sure if North Carolina did or not. They may have. But we know that Rhode Island never does. Well, they eventually do. They don't do initially. But between September and really June right? And even later, even into the summer of '88, all these states hold these conventions. In these conventions, there are debates. Should we ratify this document or not? 9 of the 13 states ratified by June. So by June of '88, the Constitution becomes the law of the land. However, New York and Virginia had not ratified. And the debate in New York and Virginia is going to be contentious, with people like Patrick Henry opposing it, and powerful people in New York opposing it. And remember, in order to defend the Constitution in New York, Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay produced a series of newspaper articles that are collectively known as the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers are the best defense of the Constitution by the people who basically wrote it. Largely Madison and Hamilton. And the most famous Federalist paper is Federalist 10. What did Federalist 10 address? Wow, this would be super duper duper if somebody remembered this. Alex, do you remember this? Alec, do you remember this?
It did involve about how political parties shouldn't be necessary within the new government.
I don't.
Was that
That's possible. I don't think that was the main thing. You know, go to them.
The mistrust of like the people and like taking away the power of the people.
No, I think it was simpler than that. Yes, go ahead. Yes. It was the issue. That's why I'm not fully dismissing it because I'm not sure all the details. But Federalist 10 was addressing the possibility of a large republic. And remember, the big argument is you can't have a big republic. The only way you can have Republican government is on a small scale. And what Madison argues is not only can you have a big republic, but a big republic with conflicting interests will protect the power of government from any of those interests taking power. And that's why I didn't immediately dismiss the party thing. But I think the big issue was the large republic. Incidentally, in the debate over ratification, you have two factions, the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. What was the biggest argument against the ratification of the Constitution? There was the gigantic argument that was eventually kind of negated by a promise. Yes?
No Bill of Rights.
Right. No Bill of Rights. The fundamental argument against the Constitution was that you are creating this big, new, powerful central government that has all of these powers, the power to tax, the power to raise an army, the power to regulate, trade, to issue currency, all of these powers, but the individual citizen has no guarantee of their liberties. And so those who were suspicious that this powerful government would threaten those liberties demanded a Bill of Rights. And eventually the supporters of that government, the Federalists, said, well, as soon as this document is ratified, we'll give it to you. Really the debate over the Constitution tended to be about when it would be changed, before or after. The Anti-Federalists, many of whom would admit that something new had to be done, would admit that there were elements of the Constitution that they might have liked, but the problem was they wanted things changed before ratification. And what the delegates of the convention decided is, no, it's either take it or leave it, and we'll make changes afterwards. I mean, some of the other things the Anti-Federalists didn't like was the power of the presidency. They didn't like the fact that the tax. They were afraid of faraway taxes. They were afraid of a standing army. They were afraid of, many of the same things that were things that they were fearful for Britain from. And, one of the arguments is, well, how far have we come? We've basically created the government we revolted against. And so, this, is the discussion that is resolved when 11 of the 13 states ratified and a new government is launched. Well, let's just start with that since it is 3:30 and we're probably locked in now. We're probably put the gate down. So, see if we can escape.